Hello again, everybody. This is Steve Callis on behalf of the Power Memorial Academy Alumni Association. And in our continuing efforts to interview as many Hall of Famers as we can interview, we have a very special guest today. Ralph Wetterhahn has an incredible story to tell. I'll leave it up to him to tell it. But we want to go back, starting in the 1950s, going all the way through decades of his work. The most interesting thing to me as an archaeologist aviator, which he will explain to us what that is. But without further ado, I'd like to introduce Ralph Wetterhahn. And Ralph, my first question to you is, where did you grow up and how did you get to Power Memorial Academy?
Well, thanks for the intro, Steve. I appreciate being here on this presentation. The short answer of where I grew up was Cambria Heights, Queens, New York, but the real answer isn't that at all, no, because you see, my mother asked me at one point during senior year, what do you want to be when you grow up? And I said, Mom, when I grow up, I want to be a fighter pilot. Wow. And she said, sorry, kid, you can't do both. And that was kind of the problem I had to deal with at Power all 4 years, was trying to grow up. And Brother McLaughlin tried his best in detention to square me away, but it never really worked out. And it wasn't until senior year that I started to get my act together. And that first semester, the fall semester, I did pretty good academically. Now, you got to remember back then, they had a thing called the New York State Regents exam. That all of our courses, except for Latin 1, 2, and 3, were oriented towards taking that exam and trying to get a scholarship out of the state. And so we're all prepping for that. And then comes the spring semester, and somebody, I don't remember which brother, talked me into taking an extra course in English history. And all I can say about English history is it's even more worthless than Latin 3, okay? And the Earl of such and such becomes the Duke of something else, but it's the same guy. And you had to remember both who they were and when they were doing whatever. And it was just taking an enormous amount of time trying to memorize all this stuff. So I finally said, time out, I want out of this. And they said, no, you can't. You signed up for it, you got to take it. I said, okay, but I'm not going to do any of the work. And I didn't. I focused on all the other things. Meanwhile, I wrote a letter to my congressman about trying to go to West Point. And he came back and said, nah, there's a lot of guys trying to get in West Point, but the Air Force Academy is a better shot for you if you want to try that. Wow. Well, I wanted to fly, and I knew it didn't matter which service academy you went to, but West Point was close to home. That's why I wanted to go there. Right. But anyway, I put in for the Air Force Academy. And lo and behold, I got accepted, which stunned everybody. I mean, it really did. So that's the first thing that happened during that semester. And then one day, an announcement is made on the PA system from the principal's office that would Ralph Wetterhahn and John Boyd report to the principal's office. And I'd already had a little chat with Brother McLaughlin that morning, so I kind of knew what was going on there. So I head out of the classroom down to the stairwell with John, and as we're going down, I says, I know what I'm in trouble for, but John, you're a straight A student, you're the editor of the yearbook, what's going on? And he looks at me and he is in a royal panic because he has no idea. Well, while we're headed down, Brother Killalea, the principal, announces on the PA system, and we don't hear it, that we both had achieved the New York State Regents Scholarship, and there were only 2 of us. Normally there's like 6, 8, 9 per class, only 2 of us, me and Boyd. So we walk into the little corridor, and the secretary is there, and she ushers us in, and Killalea He looks at Boyd with a big smile, and then his eyes drop to me. And I cannot describe the pained expression that was on his face as he smiled. And I knew he was thinking, dang, only two, and one of them is this clown Wetterhund, you know? So anyway, they congratulate us, and we head back up to class. And so late in May, we're all getting ready to graduate, and one of the brothers, I forget which one, comes up to me and says, Wetterhund, you know, you got an F in this English history course. I says, well, yeah, but it's an extra. I don't need it. He says, oh, sorry, but you cannot graduate with an F on your, you know, transcript. You got to clean it up. So you're going to summer school. I said, I got to be out in Colorado on June 26th. I don't have time for it. He said, well, you're not getting a diploma. That's as simple as that. So we have the graduation ceremony, and we all go up onto the stage. My parents are out there and everything, and they hand me the little blue thing, but there's nothing in it, right?
Oh, boy.
So I sit back down, and a couple of weeks later, I head to Colorado, and you know, you might ask, you know, did Power prepare me properly for the Air Force Academy? And the answer to that is there's nothing that can be done by any school to prepare you for that brutal summer. And, you know, it's plebe year at West Point, it's dually year at the Academy. I don't know what it is at Annapolis, but the idea is to get rid of people that aren't really, you know, wanting this. And I was in pretty good shape when I got there, but 3 weeks into it, I mean, I could hardly do any push-ups. You know, I was in such trouble, hungry all the time. It just was brutal. And, you know, we lost a third of our class to washouts and quits and whatnot. So, but academically, yeah, sure. They got my act together, taught me how to study and get through all of that. But I was not really interested in achieving any academic laurels while I was there at the Academy, because I just wanted to fly airplanes. And in order to do that, you have to have 20/20 vision. If you, senior year, if you don't have 20/20 vision, you ain't gonna fly. You are not. You go to nav school, you go to something else. So that was my goal, was just to survive physically and get enough grades to get it done. And it showed. I was always the lowest ranking. I always had the lowest rank as a cadet every year for 4 years. You couldn't get a lower rank than I had every year. And I was in the bottom of my class when I graduated. Yeah, Power got me through that academic thing, even though I hated academics. I really did. I just didn't like classroom work. I was on the bowling team there at Power. And I remember one day, and it was one of many, when the brother said, okay, get your homework out. And if you don't have your homework, stick your hand out. And he had his strap ready. He went up and down.
Oh,
well,
boy.
I had done my homework, but I couldn't find the damn thing till he got there. He said, stick your hand out. And I always had to get the strap on the left hand, because on the bowling team, if he hit my right hand, it would swell up and I couldn't bowl for a week. So this hand has been angry ever since, you know, like that. Okay, so back to the Air Force Academy. I make it through that pretty much like I make it through Power. You know, get the job done and move on to what you want to do. And I went off to pilot training, and it was a bad time for Academy graduates in pilot training, because the commander of the Air Force was a bomber pilot, the guy that did the fire raids over Tokyo, Japan, and all that. I can't remember his name offhand, but he ran for vice president sometime later with the guy from Alabama. Anyway, he decided, because of retention problems, that they would take the majority of the Air Force Academy cadets that come out of pilot training and send them to Bomber Command. So when my class come up to graduation, you get to pick your assignment based on order of merit. And I was third, and we got 2 fighters. Okay,
Oh, boy.
2. So Tom Allen, he was our top academic, top flyer, top everything. He got the first fighter, which was an F-105. And he later busted his ass in an F4, got shot down and killed. Number 2 was Jim Martin in my class. And his wife told him that if he took a fighter, she didn't want to be a widow, but she wouldn't mind being a divorcee. So he turned down that second fighter. And I tell you what, I love the bitch. I mean, I love her.
To this day.
I got that F4 Phantom, and off I went. And my life would have never been anything like it turned out to be if it hadn't been for that young lady who decided that her husband shouldn't fly fighters. By the way, later on, he did fly fighters, and he's still alive. My roommate at pilot training didn't make. In fact, none of the guys that I hung with made it. They all died within 4 years.
Oh,
So the war years, I had 3 combat tours, 1 with the Navy and 2 with the Air Force, and wound up logging 180 combat missions. And, I saw a lot of appalling stuff on both sides because we flew up north to Hanoi, which was just some brutal combat up in there. And at the end of all of that, if you are lucky enough to survive it, you look back on it and you realize that those days and nights and mosquito bites and all the other stuff that goes with it, and that was the great adventure of your life, and in fact it was. And those experiences tended to affect everything that happened to me ever since. And I think that's true of a lot of guys, and some of it's good and some of it's not so good. Guys have some serious problems with it. But I was really lucky. I was the youngest front seat lieutenant at UBAN there in 1966, the lowest ranking guy of all the guys there. And 8 months later, when I finished my 100 missions, I was still the youngest guy, age-wise. And, they threw a bunch of medals at me and sent me on my way to be an instructor at George Air Force Base, which I didn't like at all, simply because the Air Force was running bomber pilots and cargo pilots through to get them a combat tour so that everybody would have the same opportunity for career progression. That was the fact that there was a war on didn't seem to fit into the equation. And those guys couldn't hit. They could not drive bomb. They could not skip bomb. They could not shoot rockets. And most of them were older, had 2 kids, 3 kids. And, they didn't really want to be over there diving at the ground. And it showed, they didn't do well. So that's why I called up the Navy and asked them if they had any, because I volunteered to go back. And the Air Force said, no, you can't until everybody else has 1 tour. You can't go back. Okay, so I knew the Navy didn't have that rule. So I called up the personnel people at the Navy, and they said, well, yeah, we can get you an exchange tour in an A6 up there at Whidbey Island. But if you ever looked at the A6, they call the Phantom that I flew double ugly, but the A6 is like quadruple ugly. And it's a 2-seater. And I didn't want 2 seats anymore. I wanted to try something different. So I turned that down. And then a few months later, checked with them again. And they had an A7 Corsair, single engine, single seat attack aircraft with guns and all that stuff. And I jumped at it. Went up to Lemoore Naval Air Station and did my car quals. And one of the things that happens when you do that exchange tour bit is you get there, and for whatever reason, they think you know all the things they knew, that they learned at Pensacola about carrier landings and all, which of course you don't know anything. And you start practicing, and you go out on the airfield, and there'll be what's called an LSO, a landing signal officer, sitting there at the end of the runway. And they paint a little section on the runway that's the size of the carrier deck, and you land into that. You don't trap, there's no cable to stop you, but they just practice time and time again. But you got a 12,000-foot runway to do it. There's no pressure. You hit short, no big deal. You hit long, no big deal. You just correct it. And and then you go out and do it at night. And at night they turn out all the lights except the ones that are the size of an aircraft carrier. And that's actually pretty good training at night, because that's what it's going to look like. Turns out, when I got out on the boat, that the day stuff initially was terrifying. I mean, here's all this water in this little tiny boat out there, and everything is different because it's moving. And so all of your references for turns and everything are different because this thing is moving at 30 knots, away from you. But at night, it looked like Lemoore Naval Air Station. And I remember, almost finished my tour or combat tour there in the Navy, and one of the Navy guys says, "How many night bolters have you?" And a bolter is where you miss the cables and you go around and you have to come around one more time. He said, "How many bolters have you had at night?" And I said, "Oh, I haven't had any." And he goes, "What? You haven't had any?" I said, "No, because I just, it's all mental. Some of that stuff, trying to get aboard the boat at night, it's a real mental challenge. And the fineness that it takes to catch the third wire. There's 4 wires. You want to land between the second and third one. So your hook grabs the third one. The fineness to do that, you're flying at, about 130 or so miles an hour. And you basically have to put your head through a basketball hoop to catch that wire at 130 knots. So think, for example, if you're in your, sports car going 130 miles an hour, and they put a little basketball hoop there, and you have to hit it, and that's just one dimension. Now you're in this other dimension, so it's extremely challenging from a psychomotor standpoint. You're making fine adjustments with your hand and the throttles and the eyes and all of that, and if you screw this up, you're going to bust your ass. And there are guys in the Navy that quit. They were having so much trouble that it was just terrifying to them at night. The daytime stuff eventually becomes easy and actually becomes fun. But you'll never find a naval aviator tell you that the night stuff is easy. Anyway, I did that tour, even though all my Air Force buddies said you're screwing yourself over because you'll not get promoted because, you'll go to the Navy and they'll write up your fitness report, and then you'll come back to the Air Force, nobody knows you. And but I came back to the Air Force. They gave me a pretty good write-up, and the next thing you know, I get promoted way early to major, and which again shocked everybody because I'm at the bottom of the academy class, and suddenly I'm one of the top graduates now of our class, rank-wise. and so it went, So it went. So I flew fighters right up, for 20 plus years, flying the F4 and the A7, F-16, F-15. I got 1,000 hours in the F-15, and then I wound up being single, and you can't get a command unless you got a wife. So wow. I didn't have one. But I was a colonel. I got promoted to colonel early also. And the generals were trying to help me. So they said, go out to Hawaii. We'll get you an assignment out there at Pacific Air Force headquarters. And once you're there, then we'll bounce you out to Kunsan in South Korea, where we have a remote assignment where you don't need a wife, and you'll run that wing. And so this general was telling me all this, and he says, and I'm going to be the next PACAF commander, so get out there. So I get an assignment out to Hawaii, and this General Cunningham winds up getting himself in a bunch of trouble about he goes out to air bases and flies all these airplanes while he's a 3-star general. And the 4 stars didn't like that. So they asked him to quietly retire, and he doesn't show up at out there at Hickam in Hawaii. But this other general, who's one of these guys that leads through fear, does show up. And I'm working there in the plans thing, wondering what's going to happen to me now. And next thing you know, I get called down to his office, and he says, I just fired the chief of safety, and you're the new chief of safety. And we'd had a pretty bad safety year that year. And safety assignments, at least in the Air Force, I don't know about it, that's the kiss of death. I mean, you can't win those. You know, every time someone busts their ass or a plane crashes or a car runs into a telephone pole, you know, there's no good news in the safety business. So they send me off to safety school, kicking and screaming there at Norton Air Force Base. And then back I come. And I walk into that safety office, and the guys are all around me, all my NCOs and whatnot. And I said, all right, you know, I spent a couple of days looking this stuff over, and it seems to me that pretty much all we do is paperwork. You know, somebody trashes an airplane somewhere, and then we fill out all this paperwork and explain what happens and go see the boss. I says, why don't we do stuff so that we don't have to do paperwork? I said, well, like last year, where were all the ground deaths? And the guy says, well, it was during the Korean War Games, which they're happening right now, by the way. And he went through and explained that one guy electrocuted over here and puddle of water and blah, 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 blah. I said, okay, so why don't we go out there before the next war games, and you go everywhere and look at all the things that could kill somebody and fix them. And they said, yeah, yeah. And so off they went, and they went and did that. And then it's time for me to give the first briefing to this General Gregory that I mentioned. And I walk in there and I throw my first slide up, and I said, okay, we're going to have some goals, safety-wise, for the next year. And the first one I want to put up is major aircraft accidents. That's like when one crashes and burns, you know. And I put up, our goal is to have one or less. And he goes, time out. You're telling me you're going to set a goal of losing an airplane? I said, sir, you know, if the goal is 0, we can never top it. All you can do is push. I said, last year you lost 3. So if I can give you 1 instead of 3, is that going to work? And he says, all right, continue. So I went to the next one and put that goal up. And finally he says, time out. You're done, Wetterhorn. Let's go, move on to the next item on the discussion. So I just sat down. And they finished the morning staff meeting, and I go back to my office. And there's a red phone behind my chair at the desk, and it's a direct line to his office. And about the time I get there, that red phone goes off. And he says, I pick it up. I say, yes, sir. And he says, all right, Wetterhorn, I've talked it over, and you go ahead and do what you want. And good luck. So we did that. And I can't go into all the details of the things that we did there at that safety office, except to say that it worked, and it was the happiest little safety office we ever had. And at the end of the year, they had produced the safest record in the history of the Pacific Air Force.
Wow.
So I was pretty pleased with that. And about the time that took place, the end of the year, I taxied down to the personnel office, to the colonel I knew, and I asked him, I said, you know, the commander's list, and we're talking about Kunsan in Korea. I said, you know, where do I stand? And he said, well, I can't really tell you. And I looked at him and I said, you can't really tell me whether I'm on it or not, but can you tell me what the general said? And he puts his hands up like this and he says, quotes, "Your window is closed." Now, what that means is when they look at someone like me, a colonel, they want to see how many years I got left so that if I make general, I'll have time for 2-star, 3-star, 4-star. And if you don't have enough time for all that by the time you hit 30 or so years, then your window has closed. Well, I'd been a colonel for a while, but I was a really young colonel, so it didn't really matter. But it, I guess, mattered to Gregory. So I wasn't on the list. So I go back to my office and I call up personnel and I say, "You guys got anything interesting? Any flying jobs anywhere?" And the guy, "Yeah, as a matter of fact, we've got this thing in Thailand. You'll be the chief of the Air Force Division of JUSMEG, Joint U.S. Military Advisory Group in Bangkok. We'll put you through the language school and you get to fly the C-12, which is a twin-engine turboprop made by Beech." I said, "Sign me up. I'm out of here."
Wow.
So he is pissed. Wetterhahn, report to the principal's office. You know? I go down there and he says, "What are you doing?" And I didn't use the quotation marks, but I said, I think my window is closed for, moving ahead. So I'm going to go do what, seems of interest. And that's it. And he looked at me like, "You got to be shitting me." And he said, "Okay, get out of here." And I went to the language school. I went over to Thailand and had 4 years there, incredible stuff that would take another 2 hours to talk about. But we sold a bunch of airplanes to the Thais, and I wound up flying that C-12 Beech King Air up to Hanoi and to Cambodia and Vietnam and places in Laos, and visited the places where I had bombed and met some of the people I'd fought with, and particularly the fighter pilots that I'd fought against. And we got really close. You kind of have to understand that people like me and like them, we only appreciate those who pick their sides. I don't like people that go to Canada. If you don't want to be drafted, do whatever you need to do to fight it, but you don't run away. Pick your sides. And they picked their sides, and they believed in, they wanted to unify the country, and we believed in trying to keep it in a free market economy kind of thing. And so I've had many meals with some of those guys. The one, Wenbon Bai is an ace. Haven't talked to him lately, but I'd go over there and meet with those guys anytime. And you have a beer with them, and you start swapping stories. And they want to know what it was like for you to fly, and we want to know what it was like for them to fly. And so I've written stuff for Smithsonian about that and done a bunch of things along those lines.
If I could stop you for just 1 minute, because you're
Sure.
obviously a very modest guy, and you use the term, "They threw a lot of medals at me." And I just want to read for the audience the medals that they threw at you. And if you wanted to tell me after the list anything about any of them, feel free. If not, just go right on. But you received the Silver Star, the Distinguished Flying Cross, the Air Medal with 19 oak leaf clusters, the Navy's Top Gun Award, the Air Force Commendation Medal, and the Navy Achievement Medal. I may have left some out, but that's incredible to someone like me, and I'm sure will be incredible to the audience. Can you tell us anything about any of those, or do you just want to move on? If you want to move on, go right ahead.
The two that I'm most proud of are the Navy Achievement Medal, because I had 144 carrier landings and didn't dent an airplane. And so that I was quite proud. And 77 combat missions with those guys. And the other one is the Air Force Commendation Medal, which most people, sometimes that's kind of do you have a heartbeat? You get one of those. But they gave me that one for planning the Bolo mission. And the Bolo
yeah.
mission was the one over Hanoi where we simulated that we're F-105s on a bombing mission with the idea of shutting down the Northern Beach Airport. And we made 7 claims, of which I managed to get 1. But it was the planning of that they gave me that medal for. And I discovered that if you are in the planning process for something that's really dangerous, and you know you're going to ride that train, you do a much better job than somebody who could care less,
It's not.
And that's what J.B. Stone, the senior captain that was there, told us when we got in there. That's exactly what he said. You got to ride that train. And so we spent a lot of time trying to figure out how to keep alive and still get the job done on that. So those two. The others, you get placed in a situation and you either fold your tent or you manage to get through it. You don't have a whole lot of choice in that, and choice is a really important thing. I consider 2 words, bravery and courage. I consider them to be really different. Bravery is what happens when you're faced with an instantaneous decision to make that you didn't anticipate, and you do the brave thing. You don't have or you run, With courage, there's time. And Robin Olds, our commander there at Ubon, his predecessor flew 0 missions over Hanoi. His deputy commander flew 1 mission over Hanoi. My squadron commander flew 0 missions over Hanoi. But Robin Olds, who was a double ace, had all the medals, he didn't need to prove anything to anybody. He flew some 50 missions up north. And he always got called by the scheduler to see what he wanted to fly. And he could take one of the easy missions, but he always took the tough ones. And he's the only one I ever ran across like that. But I was exposed to that back as a lieutenant. And that's what I kind of tried to mold the rest of my life on, that thing, that courage where you have time to turn away. You don't have to get involved. So yeah, that's a long answer to the medals thing, but that's all I'm going into. The rest of them, I hearken back to what Pappy Boyington once said: "Show me a hero, I'll show you a bum." So yeah, I qualify for that at times. All right, so let me see where we did that, college and service. Oh, now we get to the end of that drill there. So I'm over there in Bangkok, and I go visit one of these fighter pilots up in Hanoi, and he takes me out to the museum, and we take a bunch of photographs. And my wife says, "Oh, you ought to write something up for the Bangkok Post." So I submit a little query letter and some photographs, and lo and behold, they take the whole thing and put it on 2 pages of the Sunday, review or whatever you call that, on the Sunday paper. And all of a sudden, I think I know how to write. But very quickly, I learned that that's not really the case. An Academy friend of mine sent me a tape of a writing lesson. The tape lasted an hour, and he must have covered, 30 or 40 different mistakes that writers make. And by the time that hour was done, I realized in this one novel that I tried to write that I'd made every one of those mistakes within the first 8 or 10 pages of that book. So that's when I decided maybe I better do something about that. So I applied to USC, and they're listed as one of the top 5 writing schools in the country, primarily because they're so close to Hollywood, and they get fabulous instructors, most of whom have some connection in the movie industry or whatever. And to my astonishment, I got accepted again. It's another one of those things, and which stunned my wife. And I was married by that time, I remarried. And she said, where are we going? And I said, USC in Los Angeles. She goes, "Oh, Los Angeles, how long is it?" I said, "Well, the course is 18 months. to get your degree? She points a finger at me and she says, 18 months and we're out of there. Well, that was in 1993, and here it is 2022, and we're still here in Long Beach, just south of LA. But USC, now that's the first time I really liked going to school. I mean, I looked forward to it for the very first time ever, because all of the students were there for the same reason. They wanted to be writers of some kind or another. And the instructors were fabulous. And I had a great time. And I started doing magazine work. But I will call that, I've spent 3 years there trying to get that degree, by the way, instead of 18 months. And there was boot camp for the brain. And finally, some of that stuff got in here. And the little 6-year-old finally grew up a little bit. And I got involved in magazine work. When I go to writers' conferences and they ask me to talk, I tell them I wrote my first book in 1989, and I got my first book published in 2001. And so I just usually stop there for a second and let them think about that. And I said, so now all of you are doing the math and saying, holy moly, 12 years. Is he saying if I'm sitting here trying to write my book that if I'm lucky, I might get published in 12 years? And my answer was always yes. If you're lucky, it'll take that long because you will have a great adventure in between, writing for magazines and doing things and all of that, going all over the world, which is what I did for those 12 years. And for those of you that are not so lucky, you'll get published right away, something like Gone with the Wind, and then we'll never hear about you again. It'll be over. But look forward to working, for a bunch of years before you have any success in that. And but that school at USC was, I can't highly recommend it enough. And if you're going to do graduate work, don't let some outfit talk you into doing it so that you can get a promotion in that job. The Air Force does that all the time. They try to talk you into taking some job that'll get you in the missile design business or something. And if that's what you want, great. But otherwise, you're going to hate it. But get an advanced degree in something that you're really into, and then school becomes fun. And it was for me. So I started writing, and I started winning a bunch of awards for these magazines, these little industry awards. And they published that, and then I'd get a call from a documentary company, and they'd say, well, look, we want to go back there and recreate what you just wrote about, if you're willing to go. And so I'd go on one of those documentary things. And by that time, I had enough material for a book, and then a book would come out. And so that's the way it went. I'm on, I'm working on, I just finished book 5 now, and I'm trying to get it placed. But those have all been really good adventures. And that's where the aviation archaeology comes in. The fact that I sent me to that safety school to learn how to investigate crashes, and running that safety program for a year, and having the Navy experience, carrier stuff, and the tension that, gets to you mentally and physically, and all the combat and all the different airplanes that you fly, gave me a perspective on this stuff that very few people are going to have. And it's just fortunate. It had nothing to do with me. I mean, it's just fortunate it worked out that way. But I can go to a crash site, and in a few minutes, just by looking at the way things are bent and a little bit of the story, I can start piecing it together. And one of the first things you got to know when you investigate a crash is this. When a pilot bails out of an airplane or ejects from an airplane, the one thing he always leaves behind is the truth. Okay? I guarantee you, always the truth is left in the cockpit. So when you read the description of what he or she says happened, know that 100% of the time that ain't it. That ain't it. It's something else. And you got to figure out what that is. And so that's what I do. And it's a fascinating science. Propellers tell you so much when they strike the ground. at high RPM, low RPM, high airspeed, low airspeed. Jet engines do things. Every piece of metal that hits the ground has a story to tell. And if you put it all together, and if you know what's happening in the air when people are in a dogfight, and you can piece that together, you figure out what happens. And that's what we're talking about in that early air war in the Pacific, figuring out, how this lieutenant wound up where he was, and the Japanese pilot wound up where he was, without ever finding the second airplane until we figured it out where he had to be. And I won't go further into it if you want to grab the book and look at it and try to figure it out yourself, whatever. So that's the experience that's going on. And you might ask me, well, what's my latest thing? The latest thing that I'm dealing with, and I hesitate to tell you. In fact, I'm not really going to tell you because it's very political, and it has to do with the Defense Personnel Missing in Action organization, which has been dealing with this one family. And I caught him in a lie. In fact, I caught him in a bunch of lies. And, I'm a military guy, so I contacted the guy. I said, look, I know this is false, and here's what I got on it. And I got a magazine assignment to write about this. And, I don't want to burn you guys, but can't you figure something else out here? And he wanted to know who my editor was. And I said, all right, I'll tell you who my editor is. And I did. And lo and behold, and then I called my editor and said, they're going to call you and try to kill the article because I've caught them in a bunch of lies and they're embarrassed. And she said, don't worry about it. I'll handle it. So they called her, and they didn't like her answer. So they called her boss and got that article canceled. Well, now it's going forward in next January.
Good. No, that's good.
And I'm not going to tell you any more about it because I'm amazed. I've done all kinds of freedom of information requests to find out about that previous episode, and they've denied all of the. They act like it never even happened. I mean, the whole thing never even happened, not just that part of it. It's just a pretty amazing story, and we'll see where that goes. But if I disappear between now and January, and they figure out what it's all about, well, you guys can, you put a little epitaph up there on there, says, forces of evil win again or whatever. All right, so let's see what else. Now, I just want to point out that it really helps to have an adventure girl in your life, and my wife Carol is one of those. She took me up the Everest Trail. She's taken me in the jungles of southern Thailand, and I now have gold claims up in Northern California that she's been to. And when you find someone like that, and that first book that I wrote, for example, The Last Battle, the Mayaguez incident, I mean, I spent a bunch of money going back and forth to Cambodia and hanging out with the Khmer Rouge, and in a lot of sticky situations where security was basically non-existent. And she supported all of that. We eventually got that money back, but she didn't know that at the time. So when you find someone like that, you really want to hang on to her. And so that's my little kudo to Carol, my adventure girl, buddy, wife, spouse.
Fabulous. That's fabulous. If I could ask you one thing, the term archaeologist aviator, is that just a club of one, or are there any others who are like you? Because you have such a varied background. I don't know who else can do it.
Yeah, aviation archaeology is a new science.
Okay.
I sent a query out to Archaeology Magazine, asking them if they'd like me to do an article on aviation archaeology, and that was about 4 months ago, and I haven't heard a word. from them. But, you know, the first aircraft crash was the Wright brothers airplane that crashed like in 1908 or something. So we don't have a whole lot of stuff out there to look at. But there's all kinds of things that it would behoove us to pay attention to, because we have airplanes crashing all the time. You have Malaysia 307. I mean, that one is so simple. It's child's play, but you don't see anything on it. But I can tell you all kinds of stuff about that one. There's also the crash of that Yankee pitcher that was let go by the Yankees back in, I think, right after 9/11. And he flew into that building in Manhattan.
Oh,
And
yeah.
they said that he misjudged the turn. I mean, whoa, he's got an instructor on board. He's got an airplane that has a parachute that you can deploy and it lowers the airplane down. And he goes into this building, wings level. And you're telling me, and he flew between two other taller buildings to get to it. I mean, there's stuff out there that they don't want you to know about. And they will come up with all kinds of wacko things to try to explain stuff that they don't want you to know about. And you don't have to be a rocket scientist to figure some of this stuff out, particularly with Malaysia 370 and particularly with this thing and so many others. So there are those out there who have this skill. A lot of the FAA guys, you know, that go to the accident board, things, NTSB people, they're trained primarily in metallurgy, and you know, so they check the oil to see if there's any metal in the oil. They check the gasoline. They check this. They check that. And a few of them are actually licensed pilots, but they don't have the knowledge of what's in here to the fighter pilot that never grew up flying some of these things, and they just don't have that luxury of having that experience. So we need to. So I want to put a book together of all of that stuff that I've learned from those that have written and from the things that I've been able to do to help other people, you know, advance this skill, aviation archaeology. It's out there. It's really, really important.
Well, I would suggest to people listening, if they Google aviation archaeology and your name, Ralph Weller Hahn, W.E. I found fascinating. It's like a 58 minutes that you gave. That was going into a bunch of these stories and more that I think anyone, because just like me, not knowing much about it, was fascinating. So I would suggest that you guys also, besides buying some of your book, also Google that and you'll get 58 minutes. And I just wanted to tell you on the air that Brian, who is a 68 Power graduate on the board of directors, Alumni Association, and also a pilot, not a fighter pilot, he read the one about the early war in the Pacific, 10 months that changed World War II, which you referenced before. And he, as a pilot, and just as a layman, not a fighter pilot, found it fascinating. There were maps in there you explained everything. He said it was very well written. He's familiar with your work, and he recommended it to me and to anybody listening here and now. But it's so fascinating just to listen to the one speech you gave where you just went like this for an hour. Like it was, I think it was 2013, like it was nothing, but it was fascinating. And I recommend that to all the grads who will be watching this. And there'll be hundreds of them, frankly, Ralph.
Okay. Yeah, there's all of the books. Now, the Last Battle, this one, this is out of print, but you can go on Amazon and they sell them for $5 on up. That book, I wrote that in 2001. This is 2022. And I don't think a month goes by that I don't get an email or a phone call from somebody, either who was involved with that or just read the book and tracks me down and calls. And sometimes they're in the middle of the night. And, you know, it's a one-way conversation always. I just sit there sometimes for 40 minutes. But if you're going to write books like that, you got to be willing to listen because people want to vent. They have to get something off their chest. That's why they're calling you. You cannot come up with an excuse to hang up. You just sit there and you listen and you say, uh-huh, uh-huh, uh-huh. Or, every once in a while you might say something. But that's really important. It's really important when you realize how these books, and particularly those magazine articles I wrote back then for Smithsonian and Military Officer Magazine and Popular Science and all that, same thing. I would get phone calls and people want to talk. We have time for one quick story, which.
Absolutely, but just please tell us also the documentaries. Some of your books were made into documentaries. Can you tell us about those briefly, and can we find them streaming somewhere today, or is it back things of like wherever it was, Smithsonian Channel or wherever it was?
3 of them are on Nova, and I don't know how you go about getting copies of them, but on the Nova ones, there's the last flight of Bomber 31, and that's this one here. That's a World War II Navy bomber that went down over the Northern Kuril Islands back in 1944, and we went out there and found it. After the breakup of the Soviet Union, they told the embassy that, hey, we got this airplane that's been reported up there on the side of this volcano. It may still be there if you want to go look for it, that thing. Anyway, I figured out what happened to that airplane, and that's where this story comes in. So I'm gonna
Sure.
pivot a little bit for that.
Yeah.
That book comes out, and in 2002 or 2003. But along the way, I wrote a magazine article, like I said, and it got an award. And so the documentary people came and we went back for the second go. But before I left on the second go, I get a call at like 9 o'clock at night from this woman up in Oregon. She introduced herself as Donna Llewellyn, and I knew that name. And she said, I was 3 years old when my dad went missing, and I know what you've been doing, and I want you to tell me what you can about it. So I said, well, they did everything right. They got some battle damage and over the Kurils because they were late getting there and it was daylight and the Zeros and whatnot could see them. And they had a choice, try to make it back to the Aleutians over the Bering Sea and the North Pacific. And if they ran out of airspeed and ideas, they had 20 minutes in the water. Or they could bail out over Japanese territory and be taken prisoner or worse. Or you could try to fly to Kamchatka, to Petropavlovsk, the capital of that peninsula, where you would be interned for the remainder of the war, which none of those are very appealing options, but they chose to go to Kamchatka. And they crashed on the side of that volcano. I said, except it wasn't really a crash. They were right on course and both engines had been damaged. And obviously they were above the low fog that you often see up there, which I saw on both of my visits there. And they're losing altitude, and here's this volcano sticking up out of the clouds, and there's this one area that's halfway flat. And I said, they put it down intentionally. They did everything right. And she starts crying. And I stopped, and so she's kind of sobbing there for about 20 seconds or so. And finally she gets her act together. And I said, look, I'm sorry. I didn't mean to upset you. She said, no. And she said, my father was the navigator.
Wow.
And see, always in the back of your mind is, did they get lost out over the Bering Sea because my dad didn't do his job as a navigator? did they slam into that volcano because he didn't know where he was. But she knew at that instant that her dad had measured up. And that meant everything. For the first time in her life, she knew that her dad was the hero that she always felt he was. And here it was, proof that he was, and he was. So I get those phone calls, and I just want, I could spend another hour here on phone calls and people that have called me with similar type reactions and things. So that's that documentary. And then we did one on Guadalcanal and Saburo Sakai for Nova, called Dogfight over Guadalcanal. Very famous dogfight with Pug Sutherland, Navy fighter pilot. Tremendous survival stories involving both Sutherland and Saburo Sakai.
Yeah.
And we found the Navy airplane. Again, volcanoes seem to suck these airplanes up. So that was that one. And then the other one was the Russians over Mig Alley. I'm trying to think of the title of it. But anyway, they're all three with Nova. And if you Google Nova and my name, generally speaking, they come up. One of them was listed under Secrets of the Dead, which is a Nova subtitle thing,
Right.
which you can find, but they're all there.
Okay.
The other documentaries that I've been involved with, I'm typically not the presenter. I was the presenter in all three of those, which is the guy that does all of the talking. The other ones, I'm being interviewed, sometimes at length, like the Air Aces one that still comes on about once a year. And then I get calls about that as well.
That's Operation Bolo?
Yeah, that's the Operation Bolo one, with Robin Olds and all. So that's some of them. I got a request for the last flight of Bomber 31 Nova things from someone this week. I found a copy of it. I got to figure out how to copy it and send it to him. So yeah, that's what you get into when you do this stuff. But it's very satisfying, and I've been richly rewarded and extremely lucky all the way through. And I've had cancer 3 times.
Wow.
Prostate cancer, colon cancer, stomach cancer. They thought I had lung cancer. They cracked my ribs, went in there and took out a chunk of my left lung and found out it wasn't cancer. But
Okay.
that really affected my 5K race times. but I still run every month, 5K race.
That's awesome. Well, I will say this if I could, because you probably wouldn't, but I've seen over and over again in the research I did that you are referred to as a real live Indiana Jones. And I think after people watch this thing, they will understand without you saying, yes, I'm a real live Indiana Jones. But I think what you've done, and thank you for your service from all of us, that's for sure. But what you've done, not only then, but even right up to now, still writing a book, finding what happened to these lost people, where I can only imagine what the families, they have to be so incredibly thankful. They just want to know what happened. And you're one of the few people, apparently, who can provide the answers with expertise that most people just don't have. So I think it's fantastic what you've done. Not that you need me to congratulate you, but it's just an incredible life. And interesting to me as a power guy, that a guy from Power Memorial Academy would do everything that you've done.
Hey, thank you for those kind words. But yeah, it's been a great trip, and like I said, the whole thing has been a great adventure of my life. But those first 3 combat tours, they were the big ones. They age you pretty quick.
Well, and if we're ready to wrap it up, the only thing I'd ask you is if you have some final words for the power guys, because again, hundreds of people will watch this, and they'll watch it over the next 6 to 8 weeks. But any final thoughts about power and how it affected you? I can tell from your early talks that it did affect you in a positive way. And of course, the brothers back then, even when I was there, they could be a little tougher on you than the later guys. I talked to Dennis Mooney, who's our videographer, who went there in the 80s. It was a different world by then. But I think I like the discipline myself. And I thought it was good. In retrospect, I wish it hadn't happened, but I thought it was good because it put me on the straight and narrow right through college and other things.
Well, yeah, I think I would pass along this. I would say, as you journey through your educational life and all of the experiences in the workplace and whatnot, don't be too concerned with being at the top of the heap, because that doesn't always pay off. What does pay off is finding something that, you know, your heart gets into, and doing the best at that, and all those other things that kept you in the mediocre area, the bottom of your class, no longer matter. And I think too often we shortchange ourselves by thinking, well, you know, I didn't graduate, I didn't do very well on this or that or the other. Don't worry about it. Don't worry about it. Let's just get through that and move on, and something's going to click, and then you'll be a happy camper.
I think that's some excellent advice, Ralph Wellerhahn. I can't thank you enough. On behalf of the Powell Memorial Alumni Academy Association, this is Steve Callis, and we'll see you the next time.
Take care.